Welcome to Psych for Psychology, a Nystrom and Associates podcast. Our host, Brett Cushing, is a licensed marriage and family therapist at Nystrom. Each week, he talks about all things mental health and therapy with guests, and you get a chance to dive into specific psychology topics that help promote personal development and wellness. And now, your host, Brett.
Hello and welcome to another edition of Psyched for Psychology. Glad to have you here. We're going to be talking today about relationships, and this really applies for just about any relationship. It can apply for a marriage relationship. It can apply for work relationships, any kind of parenting relationship. These are good principles to apply. And I want you to know at the outset that even if you believe someone you're in a relationship with may not change, the relationships can still change if you change. And some of you might feel, well, that's not fair. Why am I the one who has to change? You don't. You don't have to. It's simply that sometimes we want the relationship to change, and the only thing we have control over is ourselves. So the idea here is let's put the emphasis of control where it actually belongs, and that is upon ourselves. What we can't control is how we are going to behave, how we are going to react, and we can't control somebody else. So I'm going to be offering some things that are tips to sort of, you could think of it as ways to prepare or to repair in any relationship. Now, I'm going to be speaking specifically to marriage relationships, but these principles, if they are adapted and tweaked a little bit, are totally applicable for just about any relationship. So, for instance, the first thing I'm going to talk about, I'm going to be sharing 5 different things that can really save a relationship. 5 things, if we commit ourselves to these things, a relationship can really thrive. A relationship can be healthy and replenishing and enjoyable. So, again, even if you're the only one that is changing in the relationship, as you change, the entire relationship can change and likely will change. So the first thing that we'll talk about today is something we've talked about before in the podcast, and that is love languages. There are 5 different love languages. I think it was Gary Chapman in his book called Love Languages talked about these 5 different types of love languages. And the idea is that we speak the love language that we appreciate most, and there's 5 of them. So the first one is the love language of words of affirmation. That is speaking words of affirmation to somebody. Another one is physical touch. Another one is gift giving. Another one is acts of service. Another one is extended time together. So that's words of affirmation, physical touch, gift giving, acts of service, and extended time. We sort of intuitively know which one is ours. Maybe we have a top 2 of those 5 that we not only speak that more naturally to other people, but the reason we do is because that's what's important to us. So, for instance, my love languages are physical touch, words of affirmation, probably in reverse order there. I really feel loved when I hear words of affirmation. So right now I'm sort of imagining all of you listening and thinking, wow, Brett's doing a great job. Because that is how I feel loved and appreciated. Now, this certainly applies in marriage relationships, but it can apply with kids. It can apply in a work environment. Now, in work, we're not necessarily out to show our employees and colleagues that we love them. Now, that can be maybe even not appropriate in some work environments. However, being loved and feeling appreciated are very similar too. And so we can show people we appreciate them through these 5 love languages. And the idea is to know what the other person we're in a relationship with, to know what they tend to sort of default to. Which love language is it? So if you have somebody who works with you and their love language is extended time, if you have a partner, a spouse, a child, and you know and you can figure out that their love language is extended time or gift giving, you may want to ask yourself, how am I doing in speaking that person's love language? And another great thing to do is ask somebody. Now, in a work environment, you might not want to ask, hey, how am I doing speaking your love language? But you might want to sort of present the concept and say, I just want people to feel appreciated. So people feel appreciated in various different ways, words of affirmation, gift giving, things like that. Where do you feel most appreciated, and how am I doing? Maybe on a scale of 1 to 5, how am I doing in speaking your love language? Now, notice the feedback we get. We can feel threatened sometimes by what people say. So, for instance, if I ask somebody that works for me, how am I doing in speaking your love language or showing appreciation to you? And on a scale of 1 to 5, 5 being fantastic and 2 being not so good, they give me a 2. My initial reaction, probably going to beat myself up a little bit, be a little bit critical of myself, blame myself. That's not the goal. The goal is just to get feedback and to take that feedback and say, okay, hey, this is great. This is helpful, because it's not an issue of intention. It's an issue of effectiveness. And we're just trying to find out, am I being effective or not? Kind of like this. If someone has an itch on their back, my wife may have an itch on her back and ask me to scratch her back. And I'm scratching and I'm saying, is this the spot? I'm just asking, am I hitting the spot or not? Or am I missing? And she'll say, oh, no, up more to the right, so to speak. And I keep moving and I ask for feedback. How am I doing? Am I getting that spot? And when I hit it, she'll go, oh, yeah, that's the spot, right? Don't stop. That's the idea here, is to give feedback. It's not to blame ourselves. It's just to get feedback and say, oh, okay, I want to be more effective. So an important aspect in any relationship is knowing the other person's love language, knowing another person's appreciation language, if you will, and seeking feedback. Hey, how am I doing in this area? I know what my intention is, but I don't know how effective I'm being. I want to be more effective. Now, another thing that's important in a marriage context, I talk about couch time. This is very important, where I encourage couples to spend time you don't have to be on a couch. You can be at a table talking to each other. But the idea is you're just together, no interruptions, no cell phones, no calls, no kids, no telephone, TV programs, you name it. Nothing gets in the way. There's a very strict boundary for couch time. And it's it can only be 15, 20 minutes a day, but it's concerted, focused time just on listening to the other. Now, again, this is for a marriage, but it actually can apply with time with kids. It can apply with an employee, supervisor relationship, just spending time on a regular, consistent basis, listening to the other person. When we meet with our employees, our staff, we might want to ask, hey, how are things going for you in general? And let people talk about their personal lives, even if they want. That's important. That's a big part of who they are. And they bring that to work. And likewise with spouses and partners and even kids, we want to ask them, how was their day? Because that's a big part of their life. And the idea is to listen. And how do we let somebody know we're listening? Well, part of it is just making sure we have all of our focus, all of our attention on that person. And then we give them feedback. We tell them, this is what I'm hearing you say. This is what I'm hearing how you feel. And that might sound weird and foreign to us because we normally don't do that. We normally don't say, so this is what I'm hearing you say. Or we typically may not say to somebody, well, it sounds to me like you feel betrayed or something like that. And yet, even though it's not natural, it is something that is very effective. And so in a relationship, what's key is to have that couch time or that undivided attention time where we give people we're working with, we're giving people we're living with concerted time and effort and energy and attention to them. It communicates their primacy, their importance, and their value when we can do that, and we do it on a regular basis. And we create a boundary so that nothing gets in the way of that. So you can see just those two things already. If we were to speak somebody's love language on a consistent basis, seek feedback on how we're doing, and always try to improve to be more effective, while also scheduling on a very intentional basis, like couch time or just concerted time listening to people. And again, listening, not talking, but listening to people. Just doing those two things can absolutely change a relationship. But wait, there's more. Kind of sounds like an infomercial, doesn't it? But wait, there's more. There's more things we can do that are important. One is, a third thing actually, is to never say you're sorry. Now, I know that sounds counterintuitive, but think about it this way. I encourage people in relationships to not say they're sorry when they've blown it. Okay, so again, this is a marriage and a partner relationship with parents to kids, kids to parents, even at work. When we blow it, and it's inevitable that we're going to blow it, we're going to make mistakes. Do not say when you've blown it, do not say to the other person, I'm really sorry. And here's why. If I have offended somebody, let's say I have offended you. If I have offended you as the offender, I was the one in control when I was offending you. Now, when I come back to you and I say, hey, you know what? I'm really sorry about that. Who's in control now? Well, I am, right? I'm in control. And you, just like during the offense, were passive and just the recipient of my actions. When I just say I'm sorry, I'm in control, and still you're in a passive stance. And you just sort of have to take it, and just receive whatever I give you. So instead, we want to give up control, and we want to give it over to the person we have offended. So rather than say, hey, I'm sorry, I also encourage people to replace that with a confession and a request or an ask. So in other words, if I am always, let's say you're a client of mine coming in for therapy and I'm always 15 minutes late, and I just say, hey, I'm really sorry. Yeah, I just running behind again today. Notice I'm still in control. Whereas if I say to you, hey, you know what? I've been late the past 3 sessions with you. I've been late by 15 minutes. I recognize that. I really regret that. I'm going to work on that so that it doesn't happen again. And I'm asking that you can forgive me for that. Now notice, whether that's with a client or with a spouse or even with a kid or a kid to a parent, as a boss to an employee, how empowering is that to the person who's been offended? They are being given control. When I say, hey, this is what I've done, and I confess what I've done, and then I give an example of what I'm going to do to not do that anymore, and then ask for forgiveness, I am giving up power. I'm taking a step down, so to speak. And I'm giving you power and I'm giving you control. And that's appropriate when I have first offended you and I took control and power. It's a real wonderful thing to do. Now, there are little caveats that go along with this. One is that a lot of times when we say we're sorry, we let our butt hang out, right? So we say things like, I'm sorry, but... and then we give our reason why we did something. And it comes across as though we're really invalidating the other person, and we're invalidating our apology because it sounds like we're defending why we behaved a certain way. So when I say, I'm sorry, but, and I leave my butt hang out, people don't get a sense that we really are that sorry. However, when we get rid of the I'm sorry altogether, we're taking full ownership of what we've done, and we're validating the other person, what it must have been like for them as we confess what we've done, and then we're asking for forgiveness. Now, another important caveat with this is that when we're receiving this, we can be honest. And so when my wife and I have done this, we've asked for forgiveness, and my wife has maybe asked for my forgiveness on something, and I'm just still upset. And I can say, well, of course I forgive you. I'm just not there right now. I just need a little bit of time. That's okay. That's appropriate. That's being sincere and genuine. So it's important when we ask for forgiveness, we don't expect somebody to just give that to us automatically. No, it's a genuine request that comes out of real contrition in our heart that we've done something wrong. And it's acknowledging that, yeah, I have offended you, and I get that, and you don't have to forgive me. If somebody has to forgive me, then why even ask? So it's acknowledgement in a wholehearted way that, yeah, I've blown it here. Now, a lot of times as parents or as supervisors, if we're in a position of power higher than somebody else, or it's perceived that way, a lot of times, especially as parents and even as supervisors, we can feel like, I can't let people see my weaknesses, or I have to be this great example to my staff or to my kids. And really, what are we doing? We're creating this false narrative. We're creating this false image of perfection about ourselves that is not accurate, nor, especially in the area of parenting, is that really helpful, nor is it effective. Because if we think our kids need to see us as perfect all the time, that's what they believe they need to live up to, is perfection. But when we model this, and we model just saying, hey, this is what I did, I really regret this, I'm going to work on this, and I hope you can forgive me for it. Now we're modeling exactly what the world needs. The world needs to see, how do we live in mercy and grace? The world does not need to see, how do I live perfectly, because that just creates anxiety and pressure that's unrealistic. What we need to see is, how do we live? What does it look like to act and live in the freedom that comes from mercy and grace of other people? So in review, a couple relational things we've talked about that are really helpful is to speak people's love language and to seek feedback. How am I doing in this area? What can I do better to be more effective? And to do this on a consistent basis, checking in with people like that. Another thing is couch time or concerted time together. No distractions, where you are simply intentionally focused and listening to the other person. A third thing we just talked about is never saying you're sorry, never let your butt hang out, but rather instead, I just let my butt hang out, but rather instead, we want to confess what we've done wrong, express our desire to change and what we're going to do, and then ask for forgiveness from other people. Now, the last thing that I'm going to talk about is actually the first thing we need to be doing in relationships, and that is express validation or appreciation first. Always respond, always lead with sincere appreciation or validation. A lot of times when I'm with couples, I like them, and when we're doing therapy, couples therapy, I like them to lead with, what have you appreciated about the other person this past week? And oftentimes they have to think about it. And as they think about it, something comes to mind, and they'll say, oh yeah, I remember, you did the dishes, you took out the garbage, and you helped put the kids to bed. That was so helpful to me. And then I'll ask, well, okay, this is cool that you share this now in session. Did you share this with your partner other than just now today? And oftentimes people will say, no, I didn't really think about it. Or in other words, what we're saying is, I wasn't intentional about sharing this. Isn't it really tragically ironic that we are so quick to jump in and talk negatively about people? And yet when it comes to positive things we see, we tend to think it in our mind and we don't go out of our way to tell people. Well, when we are in relationships, we want that to be the inverse, don't we? We want to be very intentional about speaking appreciation, leading with validation, so that when we respond to people, we tell them first something that is validating. We don't have to agree with them. And that's the reluctance we have to validating. We feel as though if I validate what you've just said, if I validate your perception, that I am approving or I am agreeing with your perception. That's not the case. We're just simply saying that, yes, this is what is important to you. This is how you feel. This is the perception you have. And it makes sense that you're thinking this way, you're seeing it this way, you're feeling this way, you're having an urge for this. That's all we're saying is it makes sense. It totally makes sense. And when we lead with validation, it disarms people. People become less defensive. And we're shaping other people's behaviors. So, for instance, whether it's a marriage relationship or a working relationship or a parenting relationship, when we can lead with validation and when we give sincere appreciation, we're shaping people's behaviors. Going back to the back scratching illustration that I used earlier, when I try to scratch my wife's back, I'm just seeking feedback. Hey, is this the spot? She says, no, up and over this way or down over this way, and I adjust. And that's what we're talking about doing. And it shapes behavior when we're giving and receiving feedback from one another. And when we give appreciation, we are shaping people's behavior. Not in a manipulative kind of way, but in a way that's effective for the relationship. Like, hey, this is actually working for me. You know, when you gave me like a pat on the back and you told me how good I looked the other day, or you told me this, or you did this for me or something, that really meant a lot to me. That's just getting feedback where the recipient can say, oh, wow, that's cool. I didn't realize that. I'm going to do more of that. And again, notice how this can work in a marriage relationship. This can work in an employee work environment. This can work with kids, just about any relationship. It's kind of like this. I think about relationships, and it's kind of like being in the ocean. When I go into the ocean and I get out a ways from shore, I always make sure to find our umbrella, right? And that's sort of my fixed place where I orient and say, okay, here's where I am based upon that umbrella. Because what inevitably happens, you have the tide and you have the waves, and over even a little bit of time, we're kind of active doing things. We think we haven't moved at all, and then we look and we're like quarter of a mile down the shoreline from where we were originally. And we had no idea what happened. We drifted. That's what happens in relationships. Whether, again, it's marriage or work or otherwise, relationships drift inevitably. And we need to have something we're anchored to say, okay, this is sort of my plumb line. This is where I get recalibrated and everything's okay, where I look to shore and I see, okay, I'm aligned, right? And what happens in relationships is, I think, again, any kind of relationship, there tends to be this invisible and yet inevitable sort of autopilot button that we push unconsciously. And we just put the relationship on autopilot. Why? Because relationships are work. They are a lot of work, and we don't want to put in as much time and as effort that we need. And sometimes we think, well, it really should be different. It shouldn't be this hard. And we can object and say, yeah, it should be different. We can say that till the cows come home, and yet it's not going to change. Relationships always are hard. Relationships always require intentionality and effort to be effective. And while we may think, I don't have the time or the energy, I can validate that and say it makes sense. Yet what happens when we stop investing in relationships and in other people? When we stop being intentional in investing in our spouse, our kids, our coworkers, our employees, even our supervisors, the energy it requires to repair that relationship afterward is more than the energy required up front just to be intentional and do these things. Again, speaking people's love language, showing that you really genuinely care about them, you appreciate them, having couch time or concerted time where you just listening and letting the other person know you're listening. Confessing when you've blown it, not saying you're sorry, but confessing, taking a one-down approach, confessing you've blown it, sharing what you're going to do to change yourself, and asking the other person for forgiveness, and then leading with appreciation and validation. These things, just think about that. If you could commit to that, those four things in all of your areas of relationships, I would bet a lot of money that even if the other person isn't trying to change, the fact that you would be changing in these four areas, the relationship as a whole will inevitably change. So a lot of times we think, I just can't see this relationship ever changing. And why do we say that? Because we don't see the other person changing. We actually can focus our attention upon ourselves, the area we have control over what we do, how we are going to respond. And we can realize, you know what? I have a lot of power in this. I have a lot of say in how this relationship is going to turn out. Because I can invest into still speaking this person's love language, show I appreciate this person. I still have a lot of control over the nature of this relationship if I spend concerted time just listening to this person, really listening. I have a lot of control over this relationship if I can simply admit when I've done something wrong, confess it, ask for forgiveness. And I certainly have a whole lot of control over where this relationship goes if I simply always work hard at leading with appreciation and validation. I strongly desire that you come away from this podcast with renewed sense of hope and empowerment that you can change whatever relationships you're in that just aren't going well. I hope it gives you a renewed sense of energy to invest in those relationships. And I look forward to talking to you next time and appreciate that we can learn what we're learning on the podcast. And hopefully it will enable us to move from a perspective and subsequent question of what is wrong with that person to, I wonder what happened to that person. Maybe it'll give us more grace and more desire and effort to preserve people's dignity and value their worth. Talk to you next time.
Thank you as always for listening, and please be sure to leave us a review. While this podcast can't be a replacement for therapy, we hope you enjoyed our discussion today and join us again next time. Nystrom & Associates is always available to those who are struggling. If you find yourself in need of support and help, please check us out at nystromcounseling.com.